In January of 1943, a 26-year-old corporal from Stuttgart named Helmut Vogt wrote the last letter his mother would ever receive from him. He did not write it from a hospital. He did not write it from a prison camp. He wrote it from the ruins of a city called Stalingrad, in the middle of a Soviet encirclement that had been closing for 60 days in a basement that smelled of frostbite and men who had given up. The letter was 12 sentences long. His mother kept it for the rest of her life in a tin box under her bed. After the war, when a researcher collected letters from the Stalingrad pocket for a historical archive, she turned it over without speaking. Most of the letter described ordinary things: the cold, a memory of a Christmas meal from 1938, a request that she give his dog to the neighbor boy on the next street. The last 3 sentences were not ordinary. He wrote, "We have been told we may be taken prisoner. I want you to know I will not allow that. I would rather the Russians find me dead in this basement than alive." Helmut Vogt was not a fanatic. He had never been a member of the Nazi Party. He was a draftee, a former apprentice carpenter, a man who had been in uniform for 2 years and who wrote to his mother every week when the mail still moved. He was also a man who was more afraid of capture than of death. And the question this story asks is not whether that fear was rational. The question is, what made it rational? What had happened in the preceding 18 months of war in the East that could make a 26-year-old man choose a frozen basement over survival? The answer begins not with ideology and not with propaganda, although both played a role. It begins with what German soldiers had done on Soviet soil before the Soviets ever had a chance to respond. Because to understand what German soldiers feared at the end of the Eastern Front, you have to first understand what German soldiers had done at the beginning of it. If this story stays with you, a like helps it reach others who care about this history. And if you're new here, subscribe. These stories deserve to be told fully and honestly. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, along a front 1,800 miles wide. 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union in the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. They carried with them, in addition to their weapons and their rations, a set of documents that had no precedent in the laws of war as they had been practiced in Western Europe. The first was called the Commissar Order. It instructed German soldiers to shoot Soviet political commissars, the Communist Party officials attached to Red Army units, immediately upon capture. No trial, no detention, shot on the spot. The second was the Security Decree, which gave German field commanders the authority to take and execute civilian hostages in retaliation for partisan activity. The ratio was sometimes listed as 50-1, 50 civilians for every German soldier killed by partisans. The third, and in some ways the most consequential, was not a written order at all. It was an understanding, communicated through the ideological training that preceded Barbarossa, that the war in the East was a different kind of war, not a war between armies under the laws of nations, a war of annihilation, what the German generals called a Vernichtungskrieg, against an enemy that was racially, politically, and ideologically defined as something less than an equal opponent. The practical consequence of these documents and this understanding was this. From the first week of Barbarossa, German soldiers began shooting prisoners. Not all of them. Not at every unit. The Wehrmacht was not a monolithic machine, and there were officers who refused these orders and soldiers who did not participate in these actions. But across enough units, in enough places, on enough days, the killing of Soviet prisoners became a systematic feature of the Eastern Front from its first hours. In the summer and autumn of 1941, Germany captured more than 3 million Soviet soldiers. By the spring of 1942, more than 2 million of them were dead, not killed in battle, but dead in captivity, starved, shot, left in open fields without shelter in temperatures that fell to -30, worked to death in mines and construction sites under conditions that violated every protection the Geneva Conventions provided. The Germans had signed the Geneva Conventions. They had largely followed them in Western Europe. In the East, they did not, deliberately, as a matter of policy, and the Soviet Union knew it. The Soviet soldiers who were captured and somehow survived and escaped knew it. The Soviet commanders who read the reports from behind German lines knew it. The Soviet government, which received intelligence about conditions in German prisoner of war camps throughout 1941 and 1942, knew it. And eventually, through word of mouth, through the testimony of men who had escaped, through the particular telepathy that travels through armies about what the enemy is actually doing, the German soldiers knew that the Soviet soldiers knew. That is the foundation of everything that follows. There is a principle in the study of atrocity that is simple and terrible. Violence creates the expectation of reciprocal violence. When you treat a prisoner as something less than a human being, you do not only harm that prisoner, you teach his comrades what they can expect if they are taken. You teach them that surrender is not survival, only a different form of death, slower and more degrading. You give them a reason to fight to the last bullet that no ideology could manufacture from scratch. The German army on the Eastern Front spent the first year of the war teaching the Red Army exactly this lesson. By 1942, Soviet soldiers, who had initially surrendered in enormous numbers, because surrender, in the early chaos of Barbarossa, sometimes seemed like the only rational option, had largely stopped surrendering. Not because Stalin had issued Order 270, which he had, declaring that soldiers who surrendered were traitors, but because the surviving prisoners who came back told the others what they had seen. And German soldiers, who by 1942 had spent long enough on the Eastern Front to understand what had happened to those 3 million Soviet prisoners, began to understand something about their own situation. They had built a trap for themselves. By treating Soviet captivity as irrelevant because Soviet prisoners, in the framework they had been given, did not really count, they had never seriously considered what Soviet captivity might mean for them. They had assumed, without articulating the assumption, that the rules they had discarded would somehow still apply when the direction of the war reversed. The Red Army began to make clear, in the winter of 1941 to 1942, that this assumption was wrong. The German soldiers who first encountered what Soviet captivity actually meant were the survivors of the early encirclements, the small pockets that formed before Stalingrad, when Red Army counterattacks cut off German units in the brutal Soviet winter of 1941. The stories those men brought back when they escaped or were exchanged did something to the morale of every German who heard them that no propaganda could have achieved by design. They described interrogations conducted with a directness that made German military questioning look polite. They described prison trains moving east in January in open cattle cars with no food and no water, in temperatures that turned exposed skin black within hours. They described camps, the Soviet system of prisoner camps, the WWII, the military counterpart to the Gulag, that were in the early years of the war as lethal as anything the Germans had built in the other direction. Some of this was deliberate cruelty. Some of it was the chaos and resource scarcity of a country fighting for its life. The Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942 was itself on the edge of collapse, and feeding German prisoners was not, in the hierarchy of a starving nation at war, a priority. But the German soldiers receiving these reports did not distinguish between deliberate cruelty and structural neglect. They received the reports as a single message. If you are taken by the Russians, you will suffer, and you may not come back. The message was not wrong. German prisoner mortality in Soviet camps, particularly in the early years of the war, was catastrophic. Of the approximately 3.1 million Germans taken prisoner by the Soviet Union over the course of the war, roughly 1.1 million died in captivity, a mortality rate of more than 1 in 3. Compare that to the mortality rate for German prisoners held by the Western Allies, which was below 1%. The Eastern Front was not the Western Front. In every direction, at every level, for every person who fought it. By the winter of 1942, the fear of Soviet captivity had become one of the most powerful psychological forces operating on the German Eastern Front, and the Wehrmacht, with the particular cynicism of institutions that create problems and then exploit them, understood how to use it. German propaganda on the Eastern Front was built from 1942 onward almost entirely on this fear. The posters, the newsreels, the official speeches, the letters from the front that were selectively published in German newspapers, all of them returned again and again to a single theme: Bolshevist subhumans, Asiatic hordes. What happens when they reach your family? What happens to the man who surrenders? And unlike most propaganda, which asks people to believe something they cannot verify, this propaganda was asking German soldiers to believe something they already suspected was true. It did not have to fabricate the fear. It only had to confirm it, amplify it, and redirect it from the rational question, why are we still fighting a war we are losing, to the emotional one, what will happen if we stop? The result was what German commanders observed and documented throughout 1943 and 1944. A fighting spirit among ordinary German soldiers that was increasingly disconnected from any belief in victory and increasingly rooted in something much simpler and much more powerful: terror. Not terror of losing the war. Terror of what came after losing the war. A man who believes he is fighting for a cause may stop fighting when the cause becomes hopeless. A man who believes that stopping means capture, and capture means the camps, and the camps mean what the stories say they mean, fights for different reasons. He fights because the alternative to him is worse than continuing. This is why the German army maintained its tactical cohesion far longer than the military situation objectively warranted. Not because of ideology, although ideology played a role for some. Not because of loyalty to Hitler, which had largely evaporated by 1943 among frontline soldiers who knew the situation better than the generals in Berlin, but because of fear, specific, embodied, rational fear of what the man on the other side of the wire would do if given the opportunity. There is a name for what Helmut Vogt felt in that Stalingrad basement, and it is not cowardice, and it is not fanaticism, and it is not the brainwashing of a totalitarian state, although it was partly all of those things. The name is consequence. Helmut Vogt's fear was the consequence of a war his country had started and conducted in a specific way. It was the bill presented for the Commissar order and the starvation of 3 million men, and the burning of villages, and the particular way that German soldiers, in the summer of 1941, had decided what kind of war they were fighting and what the people on the other side were worth. He did not make those decisions. He was 24 years old when Barbarossa began, an apprentice carpenter from Stuttgart who probably did not know the contents of the Commissar order and may never have personally witnessed the treatment of Soviet prisoners that would define his own fate 2 years later. But he lived inside the consequence of those decisions. He was going to die inside the consequence of those decisions. And that is one of the terrible ironies of what happened on the Eastern Front, that the men who paid the highest price for the crimes of the German army were often not the men who designed those crimes or issued those orders. The generals who wrote the Commissar order went home after the war and wrote their memoirs. The men who, 18 months later, sat in basements in Stalingrad, weighing the mathematics of surrender versus death, were often men like Helmut Vogt, young, ordinary, formed by a system they did not fully understand, paying a price they did not know they had incurred. The Germans who were taken prisoner at Stalingrad, approximately 91,000 men, what remained of the Sixth Army, began the journey east in February of 1943 in temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius. Many of them were already dying when they were captured. The encirclement had lasted 10 weeks. Rations had collapsed to a few hundred calories a day. Men had eaten their horses, then the leather of their harnesses, then nothing. Frostbite had taken fingers and toes across entire battalions. The Sixth Army's medical reports from the last weeks of the pocket describe soldiers who had lost 20, 30, 40% of their body weight. These were the men who began the march to the prisoner of war camps. The mortality rate in the first weeks of captivity was staggering. Men who were already on the physiological edge died in the cold, died on the march, died in the first camps, which were often no more than open fields with barbed wire around them, because the infrastructure to hold 91,000 prisoners simultaneously did not exist and could not be improvised quickly enough. Of the 91,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, approximately 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. 6,000 out of 91,000. Some died of wounds and illness that preceded capture. Some died of the immediate conditions of captivity. Some died in camps over the following months and years from a combination of malnutrition, disease, and neglect. Some were held until 1955, 12 years after Stalingrad, before the last survivors were repatriated. The men who had chosen death in the basement had, in the cold arithmetic of those odds, not made an irrational choice. But numbers do not tell the whole story of what Soviet captivity meant to German soldiers, because the fear of it was not only a fear of death. Death on the Eastern Front had become familiar. Men who had spent 2 years on that front had a relationship with death that civilians could not imagine, and that the men themselves could rarely articulate. They had seen enough of it that it had lost some of its power to terrify. Death, for a man who had been under artillery fire for 2 years, was not an abstraction. It was a familiar thing, an almost expected thing, a thing that came for the man next to you and that would presumably come for you as well. And the only question was when and how. What Soviet captivity represented for German soldiers who had absorbed the stories and the propaganda was not death, but humiliation, degradation, the stripping away of everything: identity, rank, national identity, physical integrity, that had made them feel like soldiers and not prisoners. This distinction matters because it explains something that pure casualty statistics cannot: why men on the Eastern Front continued to fight long after they understood intellectually that the war was lost. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to die as soldiers rather than to live as prisoners. That is a state of mind that no rational military calculus can account for, because it operates outside the rational. It operates in the place where a man's sense of himself lives, below the level of strategy and ideology and even survival. And the Germans who put them there were, in the most direct sense, the people who had designed and implemented the policies of June 1941. There were Germans who survived Soviet captivity, who endured the camps, the hunger, the labor, the cold, the interrogations, the disorientation of being held for years in a country where they did not speak the language, by captors who had every reason to treat them with the same indifference their army had shown to Soviet prisoners. Some of those men came back, changed in ways their families could not recognize. Some came back politically transformed, having spent years in camps where Soviet ideology was systematically taught to prisoners, an attempt to produce repatriated Germans who would serve Soviet interests in the post-war world. Some came back as quiet men who did not speak about what they had seen or what had been done to them. Heinrich Eichler, a former sergeant from Bavaria captured in 1944 near Minsk, returned to Germany in 1950, 6 years after his capture. He was 34 years old. He weighed 52 kilograms. He took a job in a factory and worked there for 31 years, and never, according to his daughter, mentioned the war in any context more specific than "it was a bad time." His daughter described him as a man who flinched at loud noises for the rest of his life, who could not sleep in a room with the door closed, who kept 3 weeks of food in the basement at all times, even in the 1970s and 1980s, when there was no conceivable reason to do so. She did not learn until after his death, when she found a journal he had kept in the camp, in a box in his closet, what he had seen and survived. She has not spoken publicly about what was in the journal. Helmut Vogt's prediction was correct. The Russians found him dead in the basement in February of 1943, when the last German positions in Stalingrad were overrun. He was identified by the paybook in his coat pocket. His mother received official notification several months later, after the German government had time to process the scale of what had happened at Stalingrad, which was a scale that required processing. She kept his last letter in the tin box under her bed until she died in 1971. She told the researcher who collected it that she had read it many times and that she had never fully understood the last 3 sentences. Not because the words were unclear, but because she could not make herself understand what kind of place produced that kind of choice. What kind of place? What kind of war? That question is the reason this story exists, because understanding what German soldiers feared at Stalingrad requires understanding what the German army had done before Stalingrad. And understanding what the German army had done requires confronting the complete arc of the Eastern Front, not just the military history of operations and encirclements and breakthroughs, but the moral history of what happened to human beings when an army decided, as a matter of policy, that the people across from them did not deserve the protections that armies for centuries had extended even to enemies. The Germans built a machine on the Eastern Front. It ran on ideology and fear and the particular momentum of a war that had been defined, from its first day, as something outside the rules that governed other wars. And then the machine turned around, and the men who had not designed it, who had only been fed into it, the Helmut Vogts of Stuttgart, the Friedrich Laukerters of Hamburg, the ordinary men who had been handed rifles and pointed east, were the ones standing in its path. The architects of the Eastern Front mostly survived it. They wrote their memoirs in comfortable houses. They testified at tribunals and explained that they had only been following orders, or that they had not known, or that what had happened was regrettable but had to be understood in context. The men who paid the real price were the ones in the basements. They always are. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner by Germany over the course of the war, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity. Of the 3.1 million German soldiers taken prisoner by the Soviet Union, approximately 1.1 million died in captivity. These numbers are presented not to create a false equivalence. They are presented because both of them represent a catastrophe, and because catastrophes of this scale do not arise from nowhere. They arise from decisions, from orders, from the specific choices made by specific people at specific moments to define a war in a way that placed the men who fought it outside the protections of humanity. The Eastern Front was the largest and most lethal military conflict in human history. More people died in it, soldiers and civilians together, than in any other theater of any other war. The numbers are so large, they resist comprehension. The only way to comprehend them is through the individual, through the letter in the tin box, through the man in the basement who decided, in the last hours of his life, that what waited for him on the other side of that door was worse than what waited for him in that room. He was probably right, and the reason he was right is the story. If this reached you, if it added something to your understanding of what that war was, at the level where it was actually lived, a like is the best way to help it find someone else. Subscribe if you haven't. These are not comfortable stories, but they are true ones. And the difference between a comfortable story and a true one is the difference between feeling better and understanding more. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family lived through the Eastern Front, as a soldier, as a prisoner, as a civilian caught between those two armies, tell me about them. Their story is part of this history. Every one of those lives matters. This is how we keep them from being forgotten.
World War II ended many years ago. The guns became silent, the battlefield disappeared. But the stories never truly ended. Millions of soldiers fought in this war. Some became heroes, some were forgotten. Many never came home. Behind every battle was a real person, a young soldier far from home, a sniper waiting in silence, a pilot flying through fire, a medic trying to save lives in the middle of chaos. This channel is made to remember those people and tell the stories history often forgets. Here on this channel, we bring you real stories from World War II. Stories of courage, fear, survival, sacrifice, and war. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps this channel continue sharing these forgotten moments from history. And if someone in your family fought in World War II, feel free to share their story in the comments below. Every family has a story. Every soldier had a life. Thank you for watching this channel, and remember, history should never be forgotten.